Dean medieval fortress in winter bore no resemblance to the tranquil scenes of storybooks. Instead of cozy halls, one found a vast and glacial monument to human hardship, designed for war and domination. These stone giants were utterly hostile to comfort in the cold months. Their towering walls, insulated and damp, seemed to draw the very chill from the landscape into their hearts. Ceilings soared into windy darkness, while 1,000 unseen cracks whispered with drafts of frost. The castle did not shelter its inhabitants from winter, it became winter's ally, a refrigerated cavern of rock. Enduring this environment demanded a resilience that borders on the unimaginable. Each sunrise brought not promise, but a renewed battle for simple warmth and continued existence. Shall we uncover 20 truths, often glossed over by history? How did lords and ladies sleep with ice glazing their bedchambers? A hidden meal solidify upon the plate before they could be eaten. Awaited every soul within those walls, high born or low. This is a journey into a realm where heat was more precious than gold and comfort a forgotten myth. A world where survival was a daily triumph, and life itself a trial by ice. Let us begin with the first frost. The castle's larder transformed from places of plenty to museums of preservation. Freshness vanished, replaced by the grim arithmetic of survival. Salted, dried, and stored. Salted meat, hardened to the texture of leather, swam in briny barrels requiring hours of soaking to be merely chewable. Dyed fish with its penetrating aroma and withered vegetables provided scant variety. For weeks and months, this monotonous cycle repeated, a culinary prison of sustenance without pleasure. The absence of green things was not a minor inconvenience, but a creeping catastrophe. Vitamin C fled the body, and in its place, scurvy took root. Gums would swell and bleed, teeth loosened in their sockets, and a profound weakness settled into the bones. It was not an occasional ailment but an endemic condition, a shadow that fell upon knight and scullion alike. This deficiency eroded strength, making the body a welcoming host for every passing fever and cough. The immune system, starved of nutrients, grew feeble and compliant. What began as a sniffle could spiral into a fatal pneumonia, with terrifying speed. Chronic undernourishment was the universal background hum of winter existence, especially during a siege. Then the gates were sealed, rations shrank to a handful of grain and a strip of salt minus hardened meat. In such times, the value of food was measured not in taste, but in bare survival calories. A turnip, a wrinkled apple, these were measures of immense worth, often worded by the wealthy. For most, hunger was a constant companion, its gnawing presence a sharper pain than the cold. Vegetables survived all as fermented shadows of themselves. Sauerkraut, pickled beets, or dried peas. Fruit was a memory of autumn, its fleeting sweetness long forgotten. The very preservative that kept meat from rot salt became a poison in excess, arching throats and straining weary kidneys. Thus, the winter diet was a double-edged sword, sustaining life while slowly leaching vitality from it. Beyond scurvy, other deficiencies marched through the malnourished halls. Alarin breathlessness spoke of anemia, a thief of energy. Children's legs might bow with rickets, their bones softened by lack of sun and sustenance. The mind itself grew sluggish, thoughts moving through a cold fog of apathy. Picture the great hall, not a place of roaring cheer, but a dim infirmary. Figures huddled close, their faces drawn, their eyes dull. The air resonates with coughs, with the low groan of arthritic joints, with the weary sighs of the perpetually cold. Digestion was a constant turmoil, plagued by blockages or sudden, debilitating fluxes. In these crowded, filthy conditions, a simple stomach ailment could race through the population like wildfire. The siege was the ultimate test of this food desert, where hope dwindled with each empty sack. Morale crumbled faster than the granary stores, and the unthinkable sometimes became necessity. To thin the stone, another enemy gathered water. The walls acted not as barriers to damp, but as vast sponges. Autumn rains and belting snow seeped through mortarless joints, saturating the rock to its core. When temperatures plunged, This imprisoned water froze, expanding with silent, irresistible force. Microscopic cracks became fissures. Fissures became gaps, a slow, relentless crumbling from within. Inside, the moist air condensed on colder stone, forming treacherous sheets of ice on walls and floors. This perpetual dampness bred life of the most malevolent kind. Mold blossomed in velvet patches of black and green, feasting on tapestries, clothing, and lungs. The hairy walls wept with condensation, creating an atmosphere thick with the promise of illness. Respiratory afflictions were not occasional visitors, they were permanent residents. Chronic coughs evolved into racking bronchitis, which could settle into the fatal stillness of pneumonia. Tuberculosis found a perfect breeding ground in these damp, crowded chambers. The castle's fabric suffered alongside its people. It swelled, warped, and rotted metal bloomed with orange rust overnight. Leather grew stiff and mold minus spotted precious books and documents became clammy, their ink bleeding into oblivion. The hearth's fight against this damp was a losing one. Smoke from inefficient fires mingled with the wet air, creating a choking, sooty mist. To open a window was to invite a torrent of cold, damp air, undoing any meager warmth. So, windows stayed shut, feeling in the damp, the mold, the smoke, and the sickness. The physical toll was comprehensive and cruel. Arthritis and rheumatism gripped the joints of the old and young alike, making every movement a pain. Sleep was a shallow, shivering state from which one awoke more tired than before. Children, with their fragile constitutions, suffered most of all, contributing to the dreadfully high infant mortality. The castle, in winter, was quite literally a sickly place, its stones exhaling disease. If the cold was a blade, the stench was a suffocating blanket. Winter meant sealed windows, stagnant air, and the concentrated odor of life within a stone shell. The moat, a frozen sewer in deep cold, would thaw at the edges, releasing a miasma of decay. This odor blended with 100 others, the acrid smoke of green wood, the pungency of unwashed bodies and wall, the sour tang of rancid fats, the ammonia sharpness of animal waste, the sweet minus rut smell of moldering straw. Latrines, mere stone seats chewed tang. Waste down the outer walls were frozen cesspitass. The contents of chamber pots were often flung from windows with a cry of gardy-loo. Animals, dogs, chickens, hawks, even the occasional pig shared the living spaces, adding their own ripe scents. The absence of any concept of germ theory, cleanliness was a fleeting physical gesture. Brushes on the floor, seldom changed, became a compost of old bones, grease, and skulldale. The water from the castle well often carried a faint, earthy taint of its own. For modern senses, the atmosphere would have been unbearable, a solid, palpable thing. For medieval inhabitants, it was simply the air they breathed. Yet it took its toll. Headaches, nausea, and lost appetite were common. The stench was a banner announcing the presence of filth and the vermin and pathogens that thrived within it. Even the lord and lady, in their solar, could not escape it. They might burn precious incense or sweet herbs to mask the smell, but it was a temporary veil. The odor was in the wool of their robes, in the tapestries, in the very straw of their mattresses. It was the signature scent of confined humanity, a stark reminder of the body's realities. The concept of a bedroom was a luxury afforded to few. For the nobility, it was a chamber often dominated by a great bed, shrouded in heavy curtains to trap body heat. To the multitude of servants, soldiers, and retainers, sleep was caught wherever space allowed. The stone floor of the hall, still gritty with the day's debris, was a common pallet. Here's the storerooms, wind minus scoured guard rooms, fables all became dormitories. Rest was taken in full clothing, boots often still on, the better to flee or fight at a moment's notice. The bedding, if any, was a thin pallet stuffed with straw, itself a haven for fleas, lice, and bedbugs. The night was a symphony of discomfort, the chattering of teeth, the scuttling of rats, the coughs of 100 chests. One slept not to rejuvenate, but to pass the frozen, interminable darkness. The cold seeped up from the stone, draining warmth from the body like a leech. To lie near the central hearth was to risk sparks burning your cloak, or to be kicked by another sleeper. For straw mattress, hailed as a comfort, was a devil's bargain, and offered minimal cushioning while hosting a thriving ecosystem of parasites. Acting with constant bites became infected so as sleep was perpetually interrupted. The consequences of such rest or lack thereof were ire. Chronic exhaustion clouded judgment and slowed reflexes, making accidents commonplace. A weakened body, starved of true rest, surrendered more easily to infection. To fall ill was often a death sentence, for the sick were isolated in even colder, dirtier corners. The servant's winter was a slow grinding down of vitality, a battle against fatigue that was inevitably lost. In this desperate economy of heat, animals were not pets, but essential utilities. Dogs, cats, even ferrets, are welcomed into beds and blankets. Their small bodies radiated a vital life minus preserving warmth. Nay, large hound at one's feet was a better defense against frostbite than an extra wool blanket. Cats, by controlling the mice and rats that pillaged stores, were valued protectors of the food supply. This symbiosis was born of pure necessity, a pragmatic pact against the cold. Yet, this intimacy came at a steep biological cost. Animals brought their own parasites into the human fold. Fleas leapt from fur to skin, carrying not just irritation, but potentially plague. Ticks and lice found new hosts in the crowded beds. The smell of wet dog, of animal musk, blended into the castle's already complex olfactory tapestry. But in the calculus of survival, warmth trumped hygiene. The comfort of a purring cat on a frozen night, the solid heat of a loyal dog, these were tangible, vital comforts. They were living, breathing hearth, and in the deep winter, that was everything. Paradoxically, the great stone fortress lived in perpetual fear of flame. While the walls would not burn, everything inside them was tender. Grand roof beams, floors, furniture, tapestries, strut adding, stores of hay and grain all awaited a spark. The primary sources of light and warmth were also the agents of potential doom. Open flames, a carelessly placed candle, a log rolling from a hearth, a torch dripping pitch onto Russia's catastrophe could be instant. Smoke was the first, silent killing. In the labyrinthine corridors, it could fill passages in minutes, causing disorientation and suffocation. The castle, designed to keep enemies out, became a perfect trap, its narrow stairs and winding halls now a smoky maze. Fighting the fire was a near-minus hopeless endeavor. Water was a scarce commodity, often drawn from a deep well or a frozen cistern. Buckets passed in a human chain, or a pathetic defense against a roaring timber fire. The very cold that plagued them became another danger during a fire. Those who escaped the flames would find themselves outside in sub-minus borrowed temperatures, dressed in night clothes. The choice was between burning and freezing. A horrific dilemma played out in panic and screams. A winter fire was thus an apocalyptic event, promising destruction not by one element, but by two. Water showed its most mischievous and dangerous face inside the castle walls. It was a stealthy invader, entering as meltwater from snow-clogged roofs or steeping from saturated masonry. Inside, it would freeze again, creating a surreal and hazardous landscape. Theckel's dagger read down from the interior of window embers were sheets of ice, like transparent armor, coated sections of wall. Floors became glazed and treacherously slick, especially on staircases worn smooth by generations of feet. A simple trip to the privy at night, holding a guttering tallow dip, was a perilous journey. A broken limb from a fall on ice could be a death sentence, leading to infection or gangrene. This internal lice was a constant, demoralizing reminder of the cold's omnipresence. They turned mundane activities into acts of courage and valiance. Beyond the immediate danger, the perpetual damp accelerated decay in every corner. Grain molded in its sacks, armor developed a crust of rust overnight, and precious documents stuck together ruined. The castle was not merely cold, it was being perpetually liquefied and frozen from the inside out. Isolation was psychological warfare. The world beyond the walls shrunk to a white, impenetrable void. Roads vanished under snowdrifts, rivers turned to solid, untrustworthy pathways. News from the outside ceased. The castle became its own entire universe, stagnant and inward, minus looking. For the active nobility, this confinement was a torture. The vibrant life of tournaments, hunts, and travel was replaced by stifling inertia. The same faces, the same stories, the same four walls day after endless day. Entertainment was primitive and repetitive: dice games, board games, the recitation of well-worn tales. Feeble winter light made reading, for the few who could, a strain. Boredom festered into irritability, and irritability into conflict. Petty grievances, ignored in busier times, festered and exploded in the close quarters. The social hierarchy felt more oppressive, the divide between warm fur and thin wool more galling. This idle, cold monotony preyed upon the mind, breeding the melancholy that could be as debilitating as any physical illness. Winter was a season of waiting, a test of mental fortitude where the enemy was the slow, cold passage of time itself. Evil winter clothing was a burdensome, ineffective armor. Layers of coarse linen and wool provided bulk but poor insulation, especially when damp. On sweater, ambient moisture soaked into the under- layers. It stayed there, leaching heat from the body. Drying anything thoroughly was nearly impossible. Garments were oft unworn, clammy for days. Furs, the privilege of the elite, were heavy and cumbersome, and famously harbored fleas. Movement was restricted by the sheer weight and volume of the attire. For the majority, clothing was drab and functional, its dyes faded, patched and patched. The feet suffered terribly. Leather boots, often poorly cobbled, let in wet and cold. The condition known as trench foot, painful, swollen, and prone to infection, was a common affliction. Stockings of felted wool helped, but could become blocks of ice. Gloves were rare for the lower orders. Hands were red, chapped, and cracked from exposure. Ears and noses were perpetually red, vulnerable to frostbite and a strong wind. This inadequate protection meant the body was in a constant state of energy expenditure simply to maintain its core temperature. It was a draining, exhausting way to exist, leaving little reserve for work or illness. The quest for fuel was a ceaseless, dangerous campaign that defined winter life. The nearby forest, work weekly stripped bare, forcing parties to venture deeper into the frozen wilds. These expeditions were fraught with peril: deep snow, hidden ice, the threat of wolves or outlaws. Felling trees with axes in the bitter cold was brutal labor. Transporting the heavy, rough cut logs back to the castle was another ordeal: dragging sledges or carrying burdens on aching backs. Charcoal, a more efficient fuel, was a luxury, its production complex and its transport costly. Thus, wood was gold, hoarded and rationed with miserly care. Only the main hall's great fireplace might burn continuously. Other hearths were lit only at strict intervals. The entire castle society would gather in the hall at night, a mass of humanity huddled toward the flames. This was less a social event than a collective survival ritual. Theft of firewood was a serious, sometimes deadly crime, for a stolen bundle could mean another's death by cold. The rhythm of winter days was set by the procurement and careful, almost sacred, consumption of fuel. The medieval castle in winter stands as a monument not to romance, but to raw human tenacity. It was a world where architecture conspired against comfort, where home was the front line and a war against the elements. Survival was achieved through grim pragmatism: layering wet wool, embracing vermin-ridden daubs for warmth, enduring endless monotony. Its peaks of a hardness of life, a depth of endurance, that is almost foreign to us now. This story is the antithesis of the fairy tale. It is a stark, sobering chronicle of adaptation and sheer, stubborn will. It reminds us, in our climate-controlled modernity, of the profound, elemental value of simple warmth. Which of these harsh realities of the frozen fortress strikes you as the most profound? Is it the silent siege of scurvy, the ever-present damp, or the psychological weight of endless winter nights? The past, in its uncomfortable truth, awaits your reflection. The gnat and the sting of winter air within a castle's great hall, a caught the profound yet was like temperature and lethargic of physical presence. The immense fireplace, large enough to stand within, moored with a futile passion, its heat snatched upwards by the soaring ceiling unguttering out long before it could reach the icy perimeter. One's breath did not vanish but lingered as a visible, fleeting cloud before one's face, a constant reminder that the air inside was barely a cousin to true warmth. These fortresses of stone and power, symbols of feudal might, transformed in the dark months into treacherous allies with the very climate they were meant to defy. Their design was a hint to defense, a masterpiece of military intimidation, yet it was a design that scoffed at the human need for shelter from the cold. Every arrow slit, designed for a bowman's aim, became a conduit for a piercing, whistling draft. Every grand vaulted space meant to inspire awe served as a reservoir for pools of frigid air. The castle did not keep the winter out of, invited it in, trapped it, and amplified its effects, becoming a geological minuscule instrument of discomfort. Merely to awaken within its walls was to commence a daily campaign, a series of strategic maneuvers against pervasive damp, gnawing hunger, and a chill that settled deep into the marrow. The romance of knights and fair ladies dissolves here, replaced by the raw and varnished logistics of survival in a beautiful, terrible frozen cage. Shall we venture further into this hidden chronicle to aspects rarely sung in ballads? Added the cold sculpt not just the environment, but the very rituals of the body and mind. What ingenious, desperate methods did people employ to trick their own senses into believing they were not perpetually on the brink of shivering? And what were the silent, creeping maladies born not of battle, but of the castle's own stone embrace? This exploration is not for the faint of heart, for it reveals a history written in shattering teeth and chill-blained fingers. It is an immersion into a reality where every comfort was hard -1, every pleasure austere, and resilience was the only true currency. Let us proceed. The seasonal death of the countryside meant the castle's diet entered a state of suspended animation, a monotonous echo of autumn's harvest. The larder became a kingdom of salt and shadow. Barrels held meat not merely preserved, but transformed by salt into dense, crystalline structures that resisted the tooth and challenged the stomach. Dried peas and beans rattled in sacks like handfuls of pebbles, promising sustenance but little joy. This food is fuel of the most basic sort, stripped of vibrancy, color, and a sense of vitality. The absence of fresh greens and fruits initiated a slow, systemic collapse within the body, a silent urge more relentless than any sword. Scurvy was the winter plague, its onset insidious. First, a lassitude heavier than normal fatigued, then the gums growing spongy and tender, bleeding at the slightest pressure. Teeth, loosening in their sockets, became a source of constant, dull agony. The skin, pale and wan, might bruise with the touch of a feather as the body's very scaffolding of connective tissue began to fail. This with no respecter of rank, in a humble lord in his fur, and a fine coat as surely as the stable boy in his rags, could turn strong warriors into frail convalescent acts, vulnerable to the next coughing sickness that raced through the crowded halls. In such a state, the common cold was not common at all, but a potential death sentence. A fever could burn through a vitamin-starved body with terrifying speed, finding no reserves to resist it. During a siege, this dietary prison became a torture chamber. Rations shrank to a cruel calculus just enough to keep a man on the wall, enough to keep him truly strong. The mind, underfed, turned in on itself, breeding superstition, despair, and a feral aspiration. The sight of a rat, once a nuisance, could become a vision of potential nourishment. The social contract stretched thin under the strain loyalty was weighed against the gnawing void in one's belly. For the wealthy, variety existed only as a memory or a fantastically expensive luxury, a wither dapple brought from a distant cellar, a jar of honey used sparingly as medicine. For the vast majority, every meal was the same: a bowl of pottage, a slab of salt fish, a chunk of hard dark bread. Flavor was an accident, satiation was the only goal. The stone itself seemed to conspire in this atmospheric oppression. It was not a dry, cold like that of a modern freezer, but a wet, penetrating chill that carried the memory of rain and loam. Walls, feet thick, acted as thermal siphons, drawing warmth from the interior and radiating a cooled amethyst that no fire could ever defeat. In prolonged frosts, a strange, beautiful, and deadly inversion occurred. The interior surface of exterior walls could grow a skin of frost, a delicate, glittering rime that melted by day only to reform at night. This was not decoration, it was a visible sign of the castle's losing battle. The resulting damp was omnipresent. It rotted the leather straps of armor, made parchment documents limp and blotchy, and caused woolens to smell perpetually of wet sheep. It was in this constant humidity that the castle's second, invisible population thrived. Molds and mildews. They flourished in corners, on tapestries depicting summer hunts, in the very straw of mattresses. The air, thick with their microscopic spores, was a persistent irritant to lungs already stressed by smoke and cold. Respiratory ailments were not episodic but chronic. The winter cough was a feature of life, a chorus that accompanied every gathering. On this fertile ground, more serious infections could erupt. The deep, racking pain of pleurisy, the wasting fever of consumption, which could turn a robust young squire into a ghost in a matter of months. The hearth, the symbolic heart of the home, was often a source of misery as much as relief. Many fireplaces were inefficient, their design better suited for grandeur than for heat retention. Smoke, refusing to be drawn cleanly up the chimney, would billow back into the room in acrid clouds. As watered constantly, and a greasy layer of soot settled on every surface, on skin and hair, seasoning every morsel of food. To be in the hall was to be in a perpetual smoky twilight, the air a tangible veil one parted with one's hands. Ventilation was a paradox. To let in air was to let in cold, yet to seal the chamber was to stew in a broth of human and animal exhalations, smoke, and damp. Thus, the castle dweller lived in a state of permanent, low-great poisoning, a sacrifice made for the dubious gift of a little warmth. The assault on the senses was total, and smell was perhaps the most besieged. Winter confined and concentrated all odors, creating a pungent tapestry unique to the season. The dominant note was wood smoke, but beneath it lay a complex strata of less pleasant aromas. The rancid sweet smell of tallow candles, the earthy, fungal scent of perpetually damp stone and rotting rushes underfoot, the pungent, ammonia sharpness of urine from chamber pots awaiting emptying, and the deeper, fecal notes from the barred rope shafts, in washed bodies, layered in wool that was seldom cleaned, contributed a greasy, human-animal smell. Food scraps, tossed to the dogs or left to molder in corners, added their own decaying perfume. For the nobility there might be the occasional fragrance of dried herbs strewn on the floor, or pomander of citrus and clove carried to the nose, but these weren't ear islands in a vast olfactory sea. One did not simply smell the castle, one wore its scent, a perfume that clung to hair and woolen skin, marking a person as an inhabitant of this enclosed, living stone world long after they had left it. The architecture of sleep was a study in hierarchical hardship. For the larded lady, the great curtained bed was a fortress within a fortress. Its heavy wool or velvet hangings were drawn tight at night, creating a tiny, private microclimate. Stones wrapped in cloth, or metal bed warmers filled with coals, might be slid between the sheets, a fleeting luxury. Yet, even here, the cold was a patient intruder. Damp rose from the stone floor through the wooden frame, and breath condensed on the inside of the curtains. For the household, sleep was a communal, public, and profoundly uncomfortable affair. The hall floor was the common dormitory. Servants, men at arms, and minor visitors would wrap themselves in their cloaks and seek a spot on the strewn stone, as close to the dying embers of the central hearth as possible. There was no privacy, no silence. The night was filled with the symphony of discomforts, snores, coughs, the rustle of straw as someone turned, a skittering of mice, the whimper of a dreaming dog. Sleep was shallow, fragmented, and rarely restorative. It was a state of exhausted surrender, not true rest. The cold ensured one never fully relaxed, muscles remaining tense, in a semi-minus conscious effort to generate heat. To sleep soundly was to risk hypothermia. Thus, the body maintained a vigilant, half-minus awake state through the long, dark hours. In this shared vulnerability, social barriers softened, but at the cost of any semblance of comfort or dignity. The night was a great leveler, where all were united in shivering discomfort. It was in this desperate context that the practice of sharing beds with animals became not a quaint eccentricity, but a vital survival tactic. Thogs, particularly large breeds, were highly valued bedfellows. Their body heat, emanating from a core temperature higher than a human's, was a focused, living source of warmth. A good hound at the foot of the bed was worth several extra blankets. Cats, though smaller, were prized for their preying presence and their ruthless efficiency as mousers, protecting precious food stores from vermin. This intimacy was purely pragmatic, a biological contract. It came, of course, with consequences. Fleas, lice, and ticks moved freely between species. The animal scent of wet fur, of earth, of the kennel became part of the bedroom's atmosphere. Yet, in the stark calculus of winter, the benefits far outweighed the drawbacks. The comfort of a warm, breathing creature curled against one's back on a freezing night was a profound, simple, and essential mercy. It was companionship of the most fundamental kind packed against the cold. Fire, the very element fought for so dearly, remained a capricious and terrifying master. The castle was a paradox, a stone shell packed with fuel. Bland roof beams, aged to tender-minus dryness by decades of hearth smoke, crisscrossed overhead. Tapestries, wall hangings, and furniture were all ready to ignite from a single rogue spark. And light itself was a danger. Torches, made of resinous wood, could drip flaming pitch. Handles of tallow or beeswax could be knocked over by a passing sleeve or a curious dod. The fear of fire was a constant, low-minus great anxiety, especially on windy nights when embers could be swept up a chimney and onto the thatch of outbuildings. If fire took hold, the response of chaotic and dark and futile. The shouted alarm fire would trigger a panic-stricken ritual. Buckets of water ores then would be passed in frantic human chains from the well or courtyard. But the effort was usually pathetic against a growing inferno. The real horror was the geometry of the fortress itself. Hero spiral staircases, designed to hinder attackers, became deadly bottlenecks for fleeing inhabitants. Portcullises could be lowered, trapping people inside sections of the blaze. The choice in a major fire was often between two horrors: burning or fleeing into the frozen, exposed Balian night clouds, where death from exposure awaited just as surely. Winter fire was thus the ultimate betrayal, turning the sanctuary into a furnace and the protective cold into an executioner. Latter manifested in its most deceptive and perilous form as ice within the living quarters. It was an alchemical trick of the climate. Snowmelt from a partially thawed roof would seep inward, only to freeze again on a colder interior surface. The result was a treacherous, hidden geography. Floors, especially near exterior walls or in poorly lit passageways, developed a nearly invisible glaze of ice. Stair treads, worn smooth by generations, became lethal slides. They drew to the guard-robe at night, undertaken in darkness or feeble candlelight, was an expedition fraught with peril. The fall could mean a broken wrist, a cracked skull, or a twisted ankle that, in an age of primitive medicine and constant damp, could lead to crippling infection or gangrene. Beyond the immediate danger, this internal ice was a profound psychological burden. With evidence of the cold's total victory, its ability to invade the most intimate spaces, to turn the homing to an obstacle course where a moment's inattention could have dire consequences. It made the simple act of walking a cautious, deliberate effort, adding a layer of constant, low-level stress to every movement. The castle, in deep winter, became a world unto itself, severed from the wider realm by walls of snow and ice. This isolation was as much a mental trial as a physical one. Roads vanished, rivers froze, but their act was arrestworthy. Messengers ceased their travels. The flow of news, of gossip, of novelty, the lifeblood of society, slowed to a trickle and then stopped. For the castle's residents, especially the active nobility, this was a form of imprisonment. The vibrant, external life of governments, warfare, and social exchange was replaced by a stifling, introverted stagnation. The same faces were seen every day, the same conversations repeated, the same four walls studied until every crack and stain was memorized. Boredom was a potent enemy. Games of chess or dice could only occupy so many hours. Storytelling relied on a finite repertoire. The lack of sunlight and fresh air bred a collective lethargy and melancholy. In this pressurized environment, small irritations magnified. A perceived slight, a habitual noise, a petty rivalry could fester over weeks of confinement, erupting into heated arguments or even violence. The winter tested social cohesion as harshly as it tested physical endurance, revealing fissures in the feudal fabric that summer's business could conceal. Clothing was a mobile, wearable shelter, but one that was perpetually compromised. The concept of waterproofing was primitive at best. Outer layers of wool, while thick, would eventually succumb to driven rain or sleet, becoming waterlogged and heavy. Upon sweat, they dried with agonizing slowness in the damp air, often remaining clammy for days. Layering was essential, but the material's coarse linen shifts, woolen tunics, and cloaks were poor insulators when damp. The body's own perspiration, trapped by these layers, contributed to the problem, creating a microenvironment of damp against the skin. For the feet, the situation was particularly dire. Leather boots, soled with more leather, provided scant protection. They soaked through in snow or slush, and the lack of breathability meant feet were often both wet and sweaty. The condition known as trench foot, or its medieval equivalent, a painful swelling, numbness, and eventual tissue decay from prolonged cold and wetness was a common, debilitating affliction. Hands, often unprotected, grew red, cracked, and blistered. Frostbite, beginning with a painful whiteness on fingertips, ears, or the nose, was a constant threat. Thus, the very items meant for protection became sources of discomfort and potential injury, a constant reminder of the body's vulnerability to the world it inhabited. The entire rhythm of castle life was dictated by the grim economy of fuel. The hearth was not a luxury. It was the pulsing, fragile center of survival. Securing enough wood to last the winter was a logistical challenge of the highest order, a campaign planned months in advance. As local woodlands were depleted, foraging parties had to travel farther, breathing the elements and potential dangers. The wood itself was oft ungreen or damp, burning poorly with more smoke than heat. The precious resource was meticulously rationed. Only the main hall's fire might be kept burning through the night on the coldest evenings. Smaller chambers, like sleeping quarters for lesser residents, might have a fire lit only for a brief period before bed, if at all. The gathering in the great hall each evening was therefore not merely social, but a necessary congregation around the sole reliable source of heat. People arranged themselves in strict, unspoken hierarchies of proximity to the flames. This daily ritual reinforced the social order even as it provided a physical lifeline. The theft or hoarding of firewood was among the most serious of domestic crimes, for it was a direct threat to the community's collective warmth, and thus its survival. The story of the medieval castle in winter is, in the end, a story of human endurance in the face of an environment turned adversary by the very architecture meant to provide dominion over it, that strips away the gilded veneer of chivalric romance to reveal a foundation of hardship, ingenuity, and raw, stubborn persistence. It was a world where comfort was an ephemeral victory, warmth a treasure, and simple survival a testament to resilience. Its hidden history of frosting fortitude serves as a powerful counterpoint to our modern expectations of shelter. It asks us to consider the profound human journey from those damp, smoky halls to our own heated homes. Which facet of this icy reality resonates most deeply with you? Is it the intimate, desperate sharing of warmth with animals, the psychological weight of months minus long isolation, or the ever minus present, acrid taste of smoke that tinged every breath and every breath? The past, in all its harsh and vivid truth, invites our contemplation. The deep, resonant silence of a winter's night, Within a castle's curtain wall was not a true silence, but a dense tapestry woven from subtle, ominous sounds. Was the groan of ancient timber contracting in the fierce cold, a sound like a ship's hull under strain. The intermittent patter of freezing drips from an interior ledge, where a hidden seep of meltwater had found its way through the stone. The scrabble of a rat's claws on a wooden beam overhead. A persistent, dry rustle that spoke of a hidden, thriving world indifferent to human hardship. This was the acoustic reality of the feasting, a constant, low-minus ever reminder of the success, fragility, and the life that unwillingly have to. Windows, mere narrow slits or small panes of thick, greenish glass set inlaid, did not offer a view but a vague, milky impression of the white world outside. They were the weakest points in the castle's thermal armor, radiating cold so intense it created a perceptible, indefinable wall of darkness inside the opening. To stand near one was to feel the warmth leach from one's body, as if by a spectral force. These windows also framed the bleak theater of the season, the relentless fall of snow, the skeletal outlines of trees, the utter stillness of a frozen Mount A vista, a beautiful desolation that spoke of nature's absolute dominion. For that, the battle against the cold was fought with tools that profound simplicity and limited effect. Beyond the hearth, personal heating devices were rude but cherished. Hand warmers, small perforated metal balls or boxes filled with hot embers or heated stones, were passed from person to person, to fleeting warmth a minor sacrament. Hot bricks, swaddled in cloth, were placed in beds or underfoot during long, sedentary meals. Yet these were stopgaps, their heat dissipating quickly into the general chill, offering only brief, localized respite. The true, inescapable reality was that one was always, to some degree, cold, was a baseline state of existence, a hum in the background of every thought and action. The body adapted by constricting blood vessels, by shivering a constant, low-minus-grade vibration that burned precious calories. People learned to move with a certain stiffness, a conservatism of motion, to preserve what little warmth their clothing and activity could generate. He sat hunched, arms folded tightly, a universal posture of self-containment against the cold. This physical reality shaped social interaction, making gatherings less about expansive conversation and more about the shared, wordless communion of huddling close to a heat source. The castle's water supply, so vital, became a source of profound difficulty and danger. Wells within the walls were a lifeline, but tying water in winter was an arduous, icy task. The stone lip of the well became slick with frost. The bucket, heavy with water, would emerge dripping, its contents already chilling towards ice. The rope could freeze to a guard's ungloved hands, tearing skin. In severe winters, the well itself might threaten to freeze over, acquiring constant breaking of a thin skin of ice or, in worst cases, the desperate lowering of heated stones to keep the water accessible. Water for washing was a luxury seldom indulged in. What little was used would freeze in the washing basins, if left unattended, or turn hands raw and red. The idea of a full bath was almost unthinkable. The logistics at heating sufficient water, the dread of exposure in a cold room, made it a rare, feared, and often medicinal undertaking. Consequently, the castle's population wore the grime of the season upon them, a layer of soot, sweat, and soil that became a second skin, adding to the general olfactory atmosphere and providing, ironically, a thin, greasy layer of insulation. For the soldiers and guards, winter duty was a special kind of torment. Standing watch on the battlements was an exercise in sheer endurance. The wind, funneled and amplified by the castle's architecture, cut through woolen leather like a blade. Breath froze on beards and the edges of hoods. Feet, standing on stone for hours, grew numb, the cold creeping up from the ground with a patient malice. To fall asleep at one's post was not merely a disciplinary offense, it could mean freezing to death where one stood. Sentries would stomp their feet, slap their arms against their sides, and shift their weight constantly in a pathetic, instinctive dance to keep circulation alive. Their vision was limited by the short days and long, profound darkness, broken only by the feeble, guttering light of a crescent torch or the distant, cold glitter of stars. The enemy they watched for was not just an invading army, but the insidious advance of frostbite-and hypothermia. The interior lighting, a constant necessity during the long hours of darkness, was itself a source of pollution and peril. Rushlights, dried rushes dipped in animal fat, emitted a sullen, smoky flame and a distinct, acrid odor. Aloe candles made from rendered animal fats, sputtered and guttered, giving off a greasy, yellow light and a smell of burning fat that permeated everything. The more expensive beeswax candles, reserved for the chapel or the Lord's table, burned cleaner and sweeter, but their light was still feeble against the pressing gloom. Its poor illumination strained the eyes, making fine work like sewing, reading, or repairing gear a tedious challenge. They cast long, leaping shadows that transformed familiar spaces into landscapes of strange, menacing shapes. The combination of smoky air and cool light created a perpetual, crepuscular atmosphere, a dim twilight that lasted from dawn to dusk, blurring the line between day and night and deepening the sense of enclosed stagnation. The castle's animals, beyond their role as living bed warmers, suffered their own winter trials. Horses vital for transport and war, were stabled in stone outbuildings only marginally warmer than the outside. Their breath hung in clouds in the cold air of the stable. Blankets were used, but feed was oft unscarce, the summer's hay running low as winter dragged on. The horses grew thin, their roots showing, their coats fun and shaggy. Dogs that were not privileged bedfellows slept in piles in corners of the hall or kitchens, competing for the warmest spots. Hunting birds, like hawks and falcons, worked ept and mews, their terror specialized in constant duty, as they too were vulnerable to the cold. The health of these animals was paramount, for they represented mobility, security, and status. Their suffering was a mirror of the human condition, another thread in the fabric of shared hardship. Waste disposal, a perennial challenge, reached new heights of difficulty in winter. The guard robes, or privies, built into the castle walls with shafts descending to pits or the moat below, became places of special dread. The dress that whistled up the shafts grew legendary, earning them the nickname draft-houses. In deep cold, the contents of these shafts could freeze, creating grotesque, rising columns of waste that had to be chipped away, horrific and dangerous to ask. Chamber pots, used at night, would often have a layer of ice on their contents by morning. The act of emptying them was a miserable chore, and the designated areas for disposal became icy, foul-smelling hazards. This ongoing battle with human waste added a constant, visceral layer of unpleasantness to daily life, a relentless reminder of the body's functions in a world where managing them was a cold, dirty, and communal struggle. The psychological landscape of the castle in winter was as complex and fraught as the physical one. The endless cycle of cold, damp, and demons could induce a state of profound melancholy, a condition the Middle Ages might have called achi-dai or spiritual sloth. It was a heaviness of the soul, a listlessness born of sensory deprivation and enforced idleness. In an age deeply attuned to symbolism, the winter was often seen as a metaphor for spiritual trial, a season of hibernation and introspection imposed by God. Its framework provided some meaning to the suffering, but differed to alleviate the daily grind of discomfort. Gambling, storytelling, music, and games were not mere pastimes but essential defenses against this mental decay. They were acts of psychological fortification, ways to create sparks of focus and camaraderie in the general gloom. A skilled storyteller or musician was a valued member of the household, not just for entertainment, but for their role in maintaining morale, in weaving a narrative that could, for a few hours, transport listeners away from the stone and the cold. For the deeply religious, the winter coincided with the liturgical seasons of Advent and Christmas, providing a framework of hope and celebration. The Christmas feast, however modest given the season's scarcity, was a vital beacon in the darkness, a ritual reaffirmation of lightened community in the deepest part of the year. The castle's winter was therefore not just a physical trial, a profound test of the human spirit's capacity to find meaning, connection, and even fleeting joy amidst profound and persistent hardship. It was a world where every laugh around a hearth, every shared story in the gloom was a small but significant victory over the despair that the cold in the stones seemed to whisper endlessly. The vast, central hearth of the great hall was a stage upon which a daily drama of survival played out. Its flame was a monarch whose favor was fleeting, its light a fragile kingdom constantly besieged by the encroaching shadows. Logs, often still damp with the chill of the forest, hissed and spat in protest as they were fed to the fire, releasing more steam than heat in their initial moments. The hearth's warmth was not a gentle embrace, but a fierce, localized force that diminished exponentially with each step away from its stone maw. One's front would be scorched, one's back remained gripped by the castle's foundational cold aced or klesen in the physics of medieval heating. Soot, the inevitable byproduct of this struggle, was not merely dirt. Out of the fine, black snow that settled on shoulders, kept it into the crease of the clothing, and tinted the very air with a granular, smoky taste. To breathe in the hall was to inhale the residue of the fight against darkness, a gritty testament carried deep into the lungs. The smoke, seeking escape, would oft uncoil lazily along the ceiling before descending in choking waves when a draft shifted, forcing coughs and watering eyes, and making the very act of gathering for warmth a form of mild sacrifice. Light, that other precious commodity, was managed with a frugality bordering on reverence. The day's natural illumination, filtering through those narrow, glacial windows, as a resource to be used completely. All tasks that required sight sewing, repairing tools, accounting, reading were compressed into these short, gray hours. As dusk fell, a somber ceremony began. Tapers were lit from the main hearth, their small flames seeming pitiful against the vastness of the darkening hall. These were aired like sacred offerings to light other, smaller fires in strategic locations: the kitchen, the chapel, perhaps the Lord's solar. Each new point of light was a victory, a tiny, defiant bubble of human order pushed back against the primeval night. But these bubbles were isolated between them laced reaches of utter blackness. Corridors were the only guides, one emery in the trailing of a hand along cold, damp stone. And moves through the castle at night was to navigate a lightless maze, where every shuffling step was an act of faith, and every unexpected sound in the dark could freeze the blood. The human body, in this environment, became its own landscape of discomfort and complaint. The cold did not simply make one shiver, it etched itself into the joints. Arthritic pains, often dismissed as the murmurs of old age, flared with vicious intensity, turning simple movements into calculated maneuvers. Fans, cracked and red from exposure in the caustic combination of cold water and ash used for rudimentary cleaning, would stiffen into claws, making delicate work agony. Toblines, painful, itchy inflammations of the skin, bloomed on fingers, toes, and heels, a common and miserable affliction caused by poor circulation in the damp cold. Sleep, as noted, was fractured, but so too was waking rest. There was no true relaxation, only varying degrees of active endurance. Even in moments of stillness, the body remained subtly engaged in its core mission: thermogramation. This constant, low-grade physiological effort was draining, a tax on energy that the meager diet could scarcely replenish. People moved with a certain economy, a deliberate slowness, not out of laziness, but from an instinctive conservation of vital heat. Laughter itself could be a brief, explosive burst that left one breathless in the frigid air. Social life adapted to these physical constraints. Conversations were held in huddles, voices low, not for secrecy, but because projecting one's voice required energy of expelled warm breath. Music was often soft, string minus bass or vocal. The blast of a horn or trumpet was reserved for ceremony or alarm, to jarring an expenditure in the muted winter world. The sharing of a cup of mulled ale or wine was not merely convivial. The spices, cinnamon, ginger, cloves were believed to heat the blood, and the warm liquid provided a fleeting, internal glow that no hearth could offer. This was medicine as much as merriment. The Catholic hierarchy was physically mapped onto the geography of heat. The lord and his family might retreat after supper to the solar, a smaller, more easily heated room above the hall, often with its own fireplace. This privileged space represented a monumental luxury, the possibility of privacy and warmth. Below in the hall, the household arranged itself in a precise, unspoken order. Senior knights and stewards claimed the benches closest to the fire's dominion. Further out, the lesser servants, grooms, and pages occupied the middle ground, where the heat was a rumor carried on the draft. With the edges and the shadows where the stone walls wept condensation, slept the lowest ranks, the casual laborers, the beggars granted winter shelter. Their sleep was the coldest and most fragile, a stark illustration of feudal reality written in degrees of temperature. The cold also shaped the very architecture of thought and faith. Winter was a time of introspection, forced upon the inhabitants by the impassable world outside. In the liturgical calendar, it was a season of penance and anticipation. Advent, leading to the Nativity. The physical hardship of winter could be interpreted, through the lens of faith, as a participatory suffering, a sharing in the austerity that prepared the soul for divine grace. The cold, the hunger, the darkness became mortification of the flesh, offering a path to spiritual refinement. This worldview did not eliminate discomfort, but it could provide a powerful framework for enduring it. The Christmas celebration, piercing the heart of winter, was thus imbued with profound emotional and symbolic weight. It was not merely a feast, but a ritual of cosmic significance, the celebration of light entering the world's darkness, of hope being born into a season of death. Even if the feast was modest, slightly better cut of salted meat, a precious stored apple, the rare tasted honey, its meaning was immense. It was a collective reaffirmation that the winter, however long, would not last forever. For the sick and infirm, winter in the castle was a sentence often without reprieve. Medicine was a mixture of herbal lore, classical tradition, and superstition, largely powerless against the aggressive infections fostered by the cold and damp. Dry fever was treated with cooling herbs, which in a freezing room could hasten hypothermia. The persistent cough might be treated with steam inhalations over a pot of hot water and herbs, a sensible therapy, but one difficult to sustain in the cold. Mostly the ill were segregated, given what comfort was possible, and left to the workings of their own constitution and divine will. Infants and the very old were particularly vulnerable. The mortality rate for children under 5 was staggering, and winter was its most efficient accomplice. A mild cold could become croup and pneumonia with terrifying speed. The grief of losing a child was a common, if no less devastating, thread in the tapestry of medieval life, and the long winter nights offered ample, silent space for that grief to resonate. Finally, there was the profound, existential relationship with time itself. Without the rhythms of planting, tending, and harvest, without the comings and goings of travelers, time in the winter castle became subjective, viscous. Days blurred into one another, marked only by the liturgical hours of prayer from the chapel matins, lauds, prime which provided a skeletal structure to the formless day. The measurement of an hour was approximate, judged by the slow burn of a candle or the angle of a pallid sunbeam crawling across the floor. This altered temporal perception contributed to the sense of suspension, of life being held in a frozen, and it made patience not a virtue, but a fundamental condition of existence. The longing for spring was not a poetic fancy, but a deep, visceral yearning for change, for liquid water, for green shoots, for the return of birdsong, and for the simple, profound relief of feeling genuinely warm again. Thus, the medieval castle in winter stands as a monument to a specific, intense form of human experience, was a crucible that tested every facet of being: physical endurance, social cohesion, psychological resilience, and spiritual faith. It laid bare the fundamental human needs for warmth, light, and community, and showcased the ingenious, desperate, and often heartbreaking lengths to which people went to meet them. To understand this winter world is to glimpse the foundations upon which our modern comforts were built, and to appreciate the profound, hard-1 resilience encoded in our history. It is to hear, across the centuries, the echoes of chatter against the cold, to see the determined glow of a rushlight in a vast, dark hall, and to recognize in those distant struggles a shared, enduring thread of the human story, the relentless, quiet defiance of life in the face of the long, cold night.